Welcome to the video, a quick history of fitness. How did we get here and where are we going? The purpose of this is to set the stage for a conversation around current training methods and how and why we are where we are in the fitness industry. And I think that it's important for us to realize that by having a contextual understanding of why the industry is where it is will help us then have a better conversation around where the industry can go. So if this isn't of interest to you, feel free to skip this video, but myself personally, I need context. So this is information that I've gathered throughout the course of my career, and I want to share it, and I want to use it as a way to set the stage for having a better conversation, and also to help us kind of question what we are doing, not only as athletes, as personal trainers, as coaches, and also just as humans. What are we doing? How are we drawing a straight line from the training that we're doing back to our health, wellness, and longevity? So first, in order to get into this, we need to talk about body modification. What is body modification? Body modification is such an interesting human phenomenon. So the definition here is the deliberate altering of the human anatomy or physical appearance. In its broadest definition, it includes skin tattooing, socially acceptable decoration like ear piercings. Scarification would also be in this. Skin stretching would also be in this. And religious rites of passage, circumcision in a number of cultures, as well as the modern primitive movement. Body modification is performed for a large variety of reasons, including aesthetics, sexual enhancement, rites of passage, religious beliefs, to display group members' affiliation in remembrance of lived experience, traditional symbolism such as the axis mundi or the mythology, to create body art for shock value and as self-expression, among other reasons. Myself personally, I have dabbled in all kinds of body modification. I have tattoos, I've been a weightlifter, I have never had plastic surgery, and I have never had a piercing. So I haven't done those things. I have had scarification, but these are all different forms of the willful manipulation of the human body. And this also, by the way, includes plastic surgery and things like that. For the sake of our ongoing conversation, we will view fitness, physical culture, and training as a form of body modification, the willful and deliberate act of changing one's own form. So this is a timeline of modern training. This is looking at ancient history all the way up to the modern world, led by this excellent quote by Socrates: "No man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength which his body is capable." So we're going to look at early accounts of yoga. You're going to have to, forgive me for my pronunciation of this, but the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, known as the classical yoga text dating back to 2,500 years ago, around the time of Buddha, sage Patanjali, composed this form of yoga between 500 BCE and 400 BCE or so. The sutras are the earliest organized representation of yoga. The popularity of this text was such, and this is at the time that it was written, the popularity of the text was such that it became the most translated text of ancient India. So chances are they've found a lot of these laying around. Earliest accounts of strength training. The genealogy of lifting can be traced back to the beginning of recorded history, where humanity's fascination with physical ability can be found among numerous ancient writings. In many prehistoric tribes, they would have a big rock that they would try to lift, and the first one who lifted it would inscribe their name into the stone. Such rocks have been found in Greek and Scottish castles. Progressive resistance training dates back to at least ancient Greece, when the legend has it that the wrestler Milo of Croton trained by carrying a newborn calf on his back every day until it was fully grown. Another Greek, the physician Galen, described strength training exercises using the haltrace, an early form of dumbbell in the 2nd century. And you can see here that these are all, a lot of these depictions are actually found on pots. So many of them have been, you can see that, like, for example, the writing on the one on the left here is kind of curved. It's possible that this was lifted from a pot and flattened. They do this a lot. And you can also see here to the right, I think it's important to note that I once had a discussion with somebody who believed that Greek and Roman statues, that no one in Greece or Rome actually physically looked like this. It was just people's imagination that allowed them to carve these remarkably anatomically correct statues. And I just don't think that that's true. I'm sure there were people that were physically trained to the point of looking like this. Especially since if you look at like the documentary Guns, Germs, and Steel, the Papua New Guineans have excellent physiques. They just have different diets and lifestyles, but their physique is well developed. Not in the aesthetic sense, but in the functional sense. I aesthetically find it interesting and pleasing, but when we're talking about bodybuilding, it's not that kind of aesthetics. So another ancient culture is Indian wrestling. These guys, the guy that you see here on the bottom left-hand side and on the very top here, this guy's name is the Great Gamma. He was a legend. If you don't know who this guy is and you're a fan of either martial arts, wrestling, or physical culture, you need to learn who this guy is. I will put a link in the description, but the Indian wrestlers are physically amazing, and this guy is not a legend. Like, he's a legend, like in the sense of his story is amazing. He's basically a modern Miyamoto Musashi, but he existed. There's pictures of him. He existed in a time period where his history was very recordable, and he was incredible. The Malayunda is an ancient form of wrestling that originated in South Asia and dates back to 3000 BCE through the folktale of the legendary Malay hero who practiced Malayunda. The earliest written record of Malayuda is, man, I'm getting myself into trouble here, Mahabharata, the ancient Indian epic of the 5th century. Practiced at least since the 5th millennium BC, described in the 13th century, is the treatise Mala Purana. It was the precursor to modern Kushti. Fighters trained in sand and mud pits, used for climbing and crawling, pulling and pushing, clubs and gata and throwing for conditioning. Now, you can look into this. I'll put links in there. It's fascinating. But the mud that they wrestle in also has, I believe, herbs in it for restorative purposes. I might be wrong in that, but I think I'm recalling that from memory correctly. And if you look, these men have incredible physiques. Their diets are mainly vegetarian and consist of milk, ghee, almonds, sprouted chickpeas, lentils, and other grains. The Great Gamma was known for quite literally drinking almond paste in like a tincture throughout the day, and he would eat incredible amounts of food. If you're wondering how big he was about 5'8" and about 185 to 190 pounds. And he was an undefeated world champion wrestler. They started training at a young age with an average training time to maturity of being somewhere between 5 to 10 years. This tradition continues today. I believe they're called the Panhuali wrestlers. Again, I will put links. They, very similar to sumo wrestling, they live together. They go into this form of training early on, and the better they do, the higher they move up, and the more benefits they get within the ranks of their stable. Very similar to sumo wrestling. Gladiators, 200 to 300 BC. Classes of gladiators were divided into 3 paths, each with a focus in development. So I'm not going to get specifically into this. You can look more into this yourself, but basically they had a power path, an agility path, and a speed path. The martial arts that they trained in were generally pancration, pugilism, and class-specific weapons. So learning how to use their armor and weapons to their advantage. Those archetypes that they developed were based off of legendary heroes. Pancration is an ancient form of Greek wrestling. Pugilism is another word for boxing. Training included running, carrying, throwing, pushing, pulling, lifting large rocks or pots filled with sand, and working with ancient dumbbells, which we already covered, called the haltres. Mainly vegetarian diets were for economic reasons. So it's important to understand that, again, these were known as stables. I find the term stable fascinating, but basically they were feeding a large number of gladiators in a stable all at once. So they would take barley and beans and they would mix them together to complete, this would be a complete protein mixture. It was typically also had other things in it like vinegar and sometimes onions and garlic and other things like that. So it had some flavor, but they also believed that many of these things had restorative benefits. And that beans and barley diet would also allow them to get enough protein while also getting enough carbohydrates to sustain their training. There's this idea that every ancient fighter is supposed to look the way we depict them in Hollywood, and the truth is, chances are gladiators looked more like the Great Gama than they looked like modern UFC fighters. Let's just put it that way, because weight classes weren't a thing. Many people volunteered as gladiators in the height of the sport, men and women alike. Average training time to maturity for a gladiator was around 5 years. So chances are you did not see a match for the first at least 3 years of training. Principles of progressive overload were present at this time. This was the case in Milo of Croton, which is just a classic, tale that comes up time and time again. This periodized system that was also utilized not just for gladiators, but for average citizens, called the tetrad. Not every fight was to the death. Gladiators were expensive, and stable owners protected their investment. This idea that they every single time would go out and fight to the death is not true. It was a show, and they weren't going to be killing people in minor bouts. So also, if you got all the way through your stead as a gladiator, you could earn your freedom if you were bought as a slave or you entered into gladiatorial training as a way to clear up your debt. That was very common. So, common traits of ancient training in physical culture. So you're going to see most of these are Western. That bottom right hand are those clubs. Those are universal. Probably one of the oldest forms of early training equipment is what we today call the Indian club, but in reality it was a shoulder conditioning device that to this day is used for maintaining healthy shoulders, which helps if you're swinging a sword around. Progressive training was present, so lifting things heavier and heavier over time. Lifestyle was focused on as a practice. You see this whether it's martial arts that are doing the conditioning, or it's gladiator training, or it's simply for health and wellness. You see this Hippocrates, the guy that was one of the earliest physicians in Greece, talked about the importance of diet and lifestyle. And this was also emphasized in tetrad training. On the lighter days, they would talk about philosophy and lifestyle training to make sure that they were taking good care of their hearts and their bodies and their minds, because they believed that health was a whole person approach, not just the ability to perform. So training methods were adhered to as practices with a higher purpose in mind, typically one of cultural significance, war, spirituality, or social development, meaning that you didn't just do it for the sake of doing it, you did it for not just the development of the body, but like I said, the development of the whole person. Often linked to another form of institution like the military, entertainment, or personal or spiritual development. I talk about personal development because lots of Greek philosophers and lots of Eastern philosophers talk about how developing the body is important for developing a philosophical mind. Many people were economically motivated. That hasn't changed much. That's pretty much still true. Focused on movement-based training, movement-specific tasks. So basically the idea at this time was that, if you wanted to get good at a movement, you did something similar to the movement or you did the movement itself. And Milo of Croton, which you see there in the upper left-hand image, he was, this is an example of, he was a wrestler. And so carrying around this calf to the point where it became a bull made him this incredibly strong wrestler. One of the things that I find interesting about a lot of these is that even in these modern stables today, like sumo and Indian wrestling, the Penhwali wrestlers, they're always in mud. There's always uneven ground. It's always this give uneven ground, which you have to understand if you already watched any of the videos about thermodynamics or biomechanics. That steals the rebound force from the body when the feet hit the ground. So when you run in sand or you run in mud, one, it's extremely unstable, and two, it takes away rebound force for the recycling of energy. So it's actually way more energy taxing. But on the other side, when you hit the ground, it's softer. So, falling into sand, although painful, is significantly less painful than falling onto wood or marble. Tools used were often other humans. You see this in sumo training today. They push and pull each other around and carry each other. Pots or bags of sand or stone or iron weights that could be held in hands, clubs, large stones for lifting and carrying. Calisthenics were common, but not like the calisthenics that we do today. Climbing ropes and ladders, logs for lifting and carrying, and pushing and pulling immovable objects or sleds of some kind. All of these exist. If you get into, if you look at the Indian wrestlers, the Penhwali wrestlers, like the really high level guys for conditioning, they grade the mud pit. And one of the ways that they do that is they basically have this like railroad tie, this massive piece of wood that's, flat all the way around, it's like a rectangle, basically. And it's got a rope around it, and they drag it around behind them to grade the mud to make it even. Well, that's the same as sled work. It's no different. And so you see this stuff everywhere, all throughout the history of physical training, and it's because these are the primary movements. And running. Let's not forget running. Lots and lots of running. Throwing. Let's not forget throwing. Lots and lots of throwing. Throwing large rocks. Throwing other people. There's a lot of throwing that goes on. Shot put is a form of throwing. Javelin is a form of throwing. But if you can imagine, much like we do slam ball work today, doing the exact same work out in a field with a large stone, it doesn't change. So that brings us up to the Bronze Age of bodybuilding, which is typically between, 18 late 1800s, early 1900s. These dates are they're dates I found. I think they're somewhat negotiable. But as you can see here, this is predating any potential steroid. No amount of eating bull testicles is going to produce enough testosterone to create steroids. And people in this age were physically shorter and smaller because of nutrition. So you'll find that their physiques, incredible in their symmetry, they're just not physically as large as we are today. So when we get to certain figures in this time period, you have to understand their size, although perfectly normal today, was exceptional at that time period. So first, we're going to get into Ludwig Durlarcher, aka Professor Attila. He is kind of known as the first personal trainer. Mainly a strongman and performer originally. He created the first 5-pound dumbbell system, focused on full range of motion movements and also specific movements. So the first 5-pound dumbbell system, my understanding was actually created from his experience of working as a marksman and snipe shooter. So he actually developed that system for marksmen to strengthen their arms and the joints and ligaments in their arms for long-range shooting and better shooting capacity. Progressive overload was definitely there. You can even see this image here in the upper right-hand side is his personal training studio, and he had all kinds of things in this that we have in modern gyms today. And one of them was he utilized large mirrors so people could look at their form. You can see on the left-hand side all the progressive dumbbells that are all there. Those would have been really hard to come by at that time. He also put these thick Persian rugs on the ground to protect the wood floors. He believed in moderate nutrition and no specific diet. You're going to see that this is somewhat a theme at this time period. He made the claim that weight training slowed aging. And also it's important to note that a lot of the training methods at this time were considered in addition to. So many of these strong men and athletes also were runners. They also played football. They did all kinds of other activities, physical activities, and they strength trained. So strength training was not the only thing that they did. They lived very physical lives. They believed in, again, movement-specific training. There's a story about Professor Attila training a boxer in that time period. And you can see, if you ever go and look at Eugene Sandow's workouts, one of those lunging punches is still in his workout that he picked up from Professor Attila. In fact, the picture in the bottom right hand there is Eugene Sandow and Professor Attila when Eugene Sandow was young. And we'll talk about him next. Oh, maybe not. Maybe we'll talk about George Hackenschmidt next. So George Hackenschmidt, this guy's really important, okay? He actually created the bench press. Before George Hackenschmidt, there was no bench press, and he also created the hack squat, which was one of the first movements to really develop the quadriceps. And you can see he's got some pretty impressive chest and quads compared to other strongmen of this era. It's also important to note that he was 5'9" and well over 200 pounds. I think he was about 220 pounds, which is about 100 kilos. Yep, there you go. Standing at 5'9". He was a champion wrestler at the time, so something that you see in his workout methods is a lot of neck strengthening, which nobody focuses on anymore, but you can see in some of these images just how incredibly well developed his neck and upper traps are as a result of his neck training. He believed in a 1/4 protein, 3/4 vegetable-based diet approach, which meant if you had a plate and you looked at your plate, 1/4 of that plate should be protein and 3/4 of that plate should be vegetable-based foods of some kind. Now that can be energy dense or that can be green and leafy. He did not state, but he did state that every person an individual needs to find their own ideal diet. He didn't believe that one diet was perfect for everyone. Everyone had different constitutions, and that experimentation was necessary to find your best constitutional diet. He focused heavily, like I said, on strength training the neck. So Maxick, aka Maxick, was the father of modern muscle control. So if anybody's talking about muscle control today, they're talking about this guy. He wrote a whole book on it. His system involved developing this not only aesthetically interesting form of muscle control, which we today call flexing, but he also believed in the mind-muscle connection, which you'll hear people talk about today. But he's basically the great-grandfather of this method. As I said, he wanted you to be able to feel the contraction. He wanted you to build kinesthetic awareness. This was really, really vital. And a lot of his strength training was isometric. He founded a system called Maxalding method that mainly focused on isometrics for developing strength and musculature, which, if you look at him, I mean, the guy is well built. His system has been compared to yoga or calisthenics in many cases. He was mainly vegetarian, and basically he contributed a lot of what we today call that brain-body connection and flexing, that ability to flex, which we utilize in bodybuilding today. Which brings us to the great-granddaddy of bodybuilding, literally the guy that wrote the book, Bodybuilding, Eugene Sandow. None of us would have a job without this guy. He was kind of a big deal. Like I said, literally wrote the book. Focused on movement-based strength training. So you can see his physique was really interesting. In fact, he originally started performing with Professor Attila as a strongman, and as time went on, people were so enamored with his physical physique that flexing became a part of his strongman shows. So this is like early single-person bodybuilding competition style movements, basically. He had a famous 5-pound dumbbell system that was sold with a book of exercises. So you could buy your Eugene Sandow 5-pound dumbbells and the book, and that was your home gym. So like, he's the guy that basically pioneered that concept. He was a brilliant businessman. He organized the first bodybuilding competition in history. He was one of the first people ever filmed by Thomas Edison. So Thomas Edison was trying to figure out ways to use motion pictures. And so he was filming all kinds of different things. Well, Eugene Sandow's physique was considered a work of art at the time. So one of the earliest recordings of a person was of Eugene Sandow flexing. There's actually a bronze statue made of him. I think it's in England. I'm not sure. But it's in a museum somewhere. He literally had to flex for every section of it. So one arm one day, the other arm the next day, one leg, the other leg, his torso, and his head. He literally had to flex his arm while they casted it, and then he had to keep it flexed while it dried. He said this was one of the most physically taxing experiences of his life, and they did it over the course of a week. I can't even imagine. That would be just awful. He was known for measuring Greek statues in Greece to mimic their proportions in his own physique. And as a young child, he was fascinated with the Greek aesthetic, and he tried to reproduce it in his life. So we can't talk about all these dudes without talking about the great Sandwina, Katie Brumbeck. She was a really interesting woman at the time period. One of 14 children born into a circus performing family. So she came by her profession, quite honestly. She defeated Eugene Sandow in a strength competition in 1902. And by the way, I'll put links in for each one of these guys. There's some really great YouTube channels that go into the history of all of this. And Eugene Sandow was no joke. I mean, the dude used to walk around hoisting a pony in the air, and she kicked his butt. She performed with the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus until she was 60. She stood at 6'1", which by the way made her a head taller than Eugene Sandow. Eugene Sandow was 5'9". So that would have been an interesting matchup. So you also have to understand that strong men in this era and women, they had bouts kind of similar to boxing where they would perform feats of strength. It was kind of like playing horse. Like one of them would have a specific feat that they were known for, and they would perform the feat, and then the other person would have to come and perform the same feat. So many of them were training to specific movements for their specific show, and then someone else would show up and prove that they could do the same movement. And so whoever could do all of it was the best, if that makes sense. That's what it means by she defeated Eugene Sandow, was she outperformed him. She performed his lifts and her lifts, and he couldn't perform her lifts. Kind of similar to early powerlifting. So powerlifting and Olympic lifting have their roots in this era. She was known for twirling her husband overhead in an act, which I think is hilarious. She had 2 children. One actually became a championship boxer, and the other one was an actor of note in his time. So Bronze Age commonalities. By the way, this is a Eugene Sandow statue, the Sandow statue. General nutrition. Focus was on well-rounded whole food diets. It's important to note that at this time, processed foods didn't really exist. So, you know, the ideal diet that we're all trying to get today, which is a locally sourced, shop daily or every couple days, organic, whole food diet. Well, that's just what everybody called food back then. So, you know, that was our optimal diet was just their diet. Movement-specific development. So at this time, a lot of pressing was mostly overhead. This had a lot to do with performing. There wasn't a lot of chest pressing at this time period, and people were lifting as a skill to develop the physical quality, not lifting specifically to develop aesthetics or power or anything like that. It was a show. It was a performance. And for the people that were doing it as hobbyists, it was the same thing. But they did know that it contributed to health and wellness. Attila was noted as having not going gray even later in life, and having the physique of a young man when he was very, very old. And he made the claim that weightlifting slowed down and exercise and fitness slowed aging. So they were very aware of this at the time period. You really commonly at this time too are single arm lifts, even with barbells. And it's important to note, see this barbell that you see in the statue image here? Those were not solid orbs. They were often filled with something. So they were often filled with like lead shot. So if you can imagine a dumbbell with 2 giant hollow balls on the end that is, we'll say 3/4 to 80% full of lead shot. If you can imagine doing a 1-arm snatch with that in the air and then doing either a windmill or a bent press, it's wild. Even incredibly strong, huge bodybuilders today would be massively challenged by doing that. Some records that were set in this era still have not been broken. Like I said, they focused on strength as a skill. Physical development through lightweight, high volume, or low rep single skill based lifts. So again, things like the bent press or the windmill or the overhead press or the single arm press, or even the snatch developed during this time period. You don't see the beginning of powerlifting in its traditional sense yet. Nobody's maxing bench press, maxing squat, or maxing deadlift. They're swinging or hoisting or throwing. It's more like Olympic lifting or kettlebell lifting at this time. Bench press, single arm press, barbell clean, barbell bench press, and single arm deadlifts were all really, really common. When they say bench press, they're literally talking about two of your buddies. You lay on like a piano bench, and two of your buddies pick up a dumbbell and hand it to you. Okay, that's the kind of bench press we're talking about. We are not talking about modern bench pressing. It's important to note. And floor pressing was also very, very common. And in George Hackenschmidt's work, he would even do a back arched floor press, where he would basically hold a wrestler's arch on his head and do chest pressing, which is kind of similar to like the arch in a power bench. Odd objects and unstable weights were really common. Feats of strength were really common. Also, thick diameter bars. That was a big thing at this time. Axle bars, big deal at this time period. Upper body development through rope and ladder climbing, as well as overhead pushing and pulling primarily. Then we get into the silver age of bodybuilding. This is where we start to see the beginning of what most of us would recognize as bodybuilding today. First, we're going to look at Reg Park. He was, I believe, English. He trained 3 days a week. You're going to notice a theme here. He was really well known at the time. Would regularly test his 1-rep max lifts after he would go through a full training cycle. So he definitely was in the direction of power. He measured progressive overload in a 1 to 2% increments. What that means is that he would perform low rep, high volume exercises, and then he would add 1 to 2% per week or per phase. He ate 3 square meals a day, but they were more like 2 meals in a sitting for a normal person. And he definitely got over 100 grams of protein. If you look up what his diet was historically, it basically sounds like lunch for 2. He enjoyed wine and Guinness on a fairly regular basis. Again, he's English. Guinness is basically breakfast food for them. 5x5 protocol. So if you've done any training, you've probably Googled some sort of training program on the internet, and you've come across the Strong Lifts 5x5 protocol. Well, that's Reg Park in a nutshell. He focused on compound movements like squats, presses, and deadlifts for 5 sets of 5 reps. This means he would actually wind up doing in really advanced 5x5 workouts, he would do up to 40 sets per workout of primary lifts. But remember, he was taking time off in between workouts. He only did this 3 days a week. So there was ample recovery time. Steve Reeves, not Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers is Captain America. But highly likely that Steve Rogers was based off of Steve Reeves. Just a heads up. He was a bodybuilder and actor in the time period. He developed the 1 set of 20 squat reps. 1 set of 20 reps for squat method. I did this in my early career a long time ago. It's really interesting. It's the idea that you pick a certain weight, you perform 20 repetitions of squats one time. So say it's 135 pounds, you do 20 squats. That's your 1 set, you're done. When you come back for your next workout, you do it again, and your goal is to incrementally increase weight over time. He focused on 3 to 5 sets of often between 8 to 12 reps. You're going to see more of an isolation method with him. Whole body, though, in a single workout, including his neck. And he worked out 3 days a week, up to 40 sets per workout. Did more specific isolation work, would start his workout with deltoids and triceps, interestingly enough. and did his squats near the end, finishing with neck resistance exercises. This is kind of the opposite of how modern programs are structured, but hey, I mean, it obviously worked for him. He did a lot of power walking and for cardio. So he talked heavily about power walking and the benefits of power walking for cardio. Used early supplementation by drinking homemade protein powders, often consisting of eggs, powdered milk, and bean flour, like, milled soybean and things like that. So then we get into Jack LaLanne. If you're of a certain age, you know who Jack LaLanne is. If you're not, you're about to find out. Jack LaLanne, again, every fitness influencer on the internet today has Jack LaLanne to thank for their career. Jack LaLanne had a TV show that ran nationwide from 1959 to 1985. He not only spoke about the importance of fitness, but he also touched on mental health as well as caring for animals. He was the nation's fitness guru for at-home fitness, using cans of beans, broomsticks, chairs, all kinds of makeshift equipment to make health and wellness accessible to the average person. He was addressed in the early shows as a physical culturist. This is where you start to see this term phased out. Physical culturist and physical culture came from Eugene Sandow. He created the term and made it quite famous. Anyway, he was addressed in the early shows as a physical culturist and spoke about the importance of nutrition, not only to lose weight, but also to gain if you were underweight. So he was not simply about weight loss. He believed in an optimal state. Fun fact, he swam towing 70 rowboats for a mile for his 70th birthday. Dude was amazing. He performed all kinds of feats of strength. He died at age 98. And his wife is still alive and still does interviews about him. Silver Age commonalities. High volume training. You'd often see 5x5, 10x10, really high set numbers. Focus on nutrition and specifically protein. This is when it became really common that you wanted to eat over 100 grams of protein every single day. And there's a lot of writing about that. And it's interesting because they even talk about getting it different ways. So either from meat or from soybeans. But this is when you start to see nutrition really come into the fold. Really commonly, mostly it was a 3-day-a-week schedule. And they would even take breaks. So like they would only train maybe 3/4 of the year and take like 3 months off. More specific muscle-based exercises. So this is where you start to see more isolation training taking place, but it's still mainly compound movements at this time. But those compound movements like the bench press are beginning to develop. Lots of stretching in the evening to enhance recovery. They talk a lot about not only taking care of their muscles, but also their joints and their tendons and their bones. Self-regulation. This is a concept of eating when you're hungry, not eating when you're full. And if I feel tired, I just don't train that day. So self-regulation, they weren't on these hard schedules that they had to adhere to. They checked in with their bodies. They had a very good sense of their physical well-being internally. Mainly barbell and dumbbell and calisthenic training at this time. You see a lot of this at Muscle Beach. Like if you look back at the old Muscle Beach photos, Muscle Beach was a great example of what a lot of the training looked like at that time. Strength sports and aesthetics begin to diverge. Powerlifting and Olympic lifting sports are developing separately, but there's still overlap. You definitely still see people testing their strength as a skill, but powerlifting is beginning to develop in its own field separately from this, because there are these periodicals that are coming out where people are listing their bench press and squat numbers, and so there's kind of this competition to see who can get the best numbers, but it's not like official at this time. It's happening through the publishing of like basically periodicals or magazines. So then we get into the golden age of bodybuilding. And what you're going to notice here is that things start to get a little weird, and it's because steroids happen. Now, there's argument as to whether or not steroids were accessed in the Silver Age. It seems that some people had an interest in them. I can put links below if you're interested, or if you have questions, I can link it in the comment section. But they just weren't available before now. But this is where the modern aesthetic begins, and it really begins with Dianabol, which is it changes the game. Let's just put it that way. And just, you may notice there's a guy on the far left of this picture. His name's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's well known for making this quite famous. Some major shifts in the physical culture or fitness world. One, the induction of anabolic steroids, cycling, and stacking. This is a big deal. Just so you know, when people go on steroids, they don't just stay on them. You have to go on them and off them to make sure you don't screw up your body. Powerlifting and Olympic lifting are going through similar shifts and becoming more specialized. They're also developing around steroid use at this time. There's a lot of focus on specific nutrition at this time. So getting lots and lots of protein. Arnold Schwarzenegger was quoted as being like, don't eat anything white. Jack LaLanne is still very heavy in the fitness world during this time period, and you'll hear him talk a lot about if man made it, don't eat it. So it's interesting, the diet itself really hasn't changed since the Bronze Age. But what you're seeing is that people are realizing that processed foods are causing health problems, and people that want to function in this capacity are avoiding processed foods. And it's also important to note that steroids allow you to metabolize more protein. They actually enhance recovery. So, if all of a sudden you can metabolize more protein because of steroids, you're going to start eating a crap ton more protein to recover faster because your body can take it in. Without the steroid, there's kind of an upper limit to that. That's even a debatable statement. I'm not going to stand by that. We don't know if there's an upper limit to it, but steroids definitely enhance your body's ability to absorb it and reprocess it. The introduction of isolation lifts and machines for targeted development happened during this time. Nautilus is well known for this, and we're going to talk about that. Tempo training and overload training become popular. Again, you can do tempo training and overload training and recover faster if you're on performance-enhancing chemicals. The fitness industry is born, and fitness becomes a, quote, lifestyle brand. This is a really important transition from it being a practice that is about developing a whole person to now becoming a brand or a product that can be bought and sold. The documentary Pumping Iron fuels this shift massively. And you also start to see the opening of commercial gyms like Gold's Gym, Bally's Total Fitness, things like that. That's going to happen as a result of this time period. And Pumping Iron, if you've ever watched the documentary, you know that this absolutely inspired and fueled an entire generation. Cold War politics also got pushed into training and development as well. It was at the Olympics against the Soviet Union that America discovered that the reason that these Soviets were absolutely blowing strength competitions out of the water was because they had started utilizing steroids, and the American coaches then came back and started experimenting with that, sometimes to detrimental effect. I can't remember the main coach's name, but he developed cardiovascular problems that he ultimately died from experimenting improperly with steroids. And popularity with women at this time also grows. There are great pictures of like Marilyn Monroe in the silver era lifting, and you'll see that there are female bodybuilding really begins at this time. Yoga and martial arts also get a foothold in the fitness industry, and we'll talk about that. So you start to see a stratification of the fitness industry. So now it's not people doing all of these things. People are starting to hyper specialize, and those are creating new, in quotation, markets. So let's talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger. We can't talk about this time period without talking about him. He began lifting at 15 years old, won Mr. Universe at age 20, and 6 more times after that. Focused on split training, high volume, 6 days a week, which again is possible to do when you're on performance-enhancing drugs. And split training means dividing the body into different body parts. So focusing on shoulders and chest and abs and back and legs, for example, these are splits. Most of the time they'd hit these splits 1 to 2 times a week, so that way that area of the body could recover while you worked another area. And if this works whether you're on performance enhancing drugs or not, but it's highly specialized toward the isolation and muscle development of that area. It does not develop other capacities like it doesn't develop things functionally. The nervous system isn't getting the stimulation that it needs for these things to operate in unison efficiently. In fact, you're moving more in a direction of hyper-specialization per muscle, which actually kind of separates their functionality to a certain degree. He ate 5 to 6 times a day, around 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day. Again, very doable if this is your full-time job and this is all you do. For a normal person, this would be really hard. Is well known for taking anabolic steroids. He's even admitted to it on film multiple times. Starred in the documentary Pumping Iron. Fueled the rise of Gold's Gym. Organized and held the largest fitness festival in the world every year in Columbus, Ohio, where all fields of fitness and sport are represented. And it's really an amazing, amazing thing. Probably the most successful physical culturist in the modern age. Continues to promote health and wellness to this day. Not many people have gone from bodybuilding to politics and business and acting, but he managed to pull it off. So an important figure at this time period is Bruce Lee, famous for his movies and films. An advocate for cross-training in weights, isometrics, calisthenics, jogging, and flexibility training. His physique was also incredible, and pound for pound, he might have been one of the strongest people in this generation. Bruce Lee was only around 135 pounds, but the amount of force that he could produce by unifying his body was unreal. He brought the use of training pads and padding into the mainstream for martial arts training. He founded a martial arts philosophy known as Jeet Kune Do, which combined multiple martial principles under one heading, and basically the rule to this day is it's stone soup. If it works, use it, and contribute to the basket of knowledge. He intensely studied martial arts and sports from all over the world. In Jeet Kune Do, you find principles from boxing, fencing, judo, karate, all walks. The guy basically used everything he could. He brought martial arts into pop culture in the mainstream. You start to see the rise of martial arts making their way into all kinds of different areas at this time. He died from an allergic reaction to a headache medication in 1973, and it was hugely unfortunate. Honestly, this guy, K. Putbi Joyce, I'm going to guess his name is. In 1948, he established the Ashtanga Yoga Research Institute at his home. In 1964, a Belgian spent 2 months with him learning the primary and intermediate series of Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga systems. Not long after that, they wrote a book. In 1975, he came to the States and stayed for 4 months, laying the groundwork for Ashtanga yoga today. During the spiritual and psychedelic awakening of the 60s and 70s, alternative lifestyles and philosophies were being explored and made famous by all kinds of people, including the philosopher Alan Watts. Notable accusations of sexual abuse were uncovered throughout his career, so that was unfortunate, but the foundation of yoga was laid, the foundation of the modern yoga industry was laid during this period of time. Dr. Kenneth Cooper, the doctor of medicine and former Air Force lieutenant colonel from Oklahoma who pioneered the benefits of doing aerobic exercise for maintaining and improving health. So everything about aerobics came from this guy during this time period, which is why I needed to mention him. Cooper studied the effects of exercise in the late 1960s and popularized the term training effect, which you see all over the place now. The measured effects were that muscle respiration were strengthened, the heart was strengthened, blood pressure was sometimes lowered by the total amount of blood and number of red blood cells increased, making the blood a more efficient carrier of oxygen. VO2 max was increased. He published his ideas in a book called Aerobics in 1968. Cooper is the founder of nonprofit research for educational organization, the Cooper Institute, which was opened in 1970. Cooper is also the founder and chairman of the Cooper Aerobics Center in Dallas and McKinney, Texas, which comprises 8 health and wellness entities. So they literally brought together all of these different fitness compositional elements under one roof, which was really, this was brand new at the time. It was a whole new idea. Now we get to talk about Arthur Jones and the Colorado experiment. This one is all kinds of crazy. So Casey Viator, from 14 brief workouts spread over 4 weeks, increased his muscle mass by 63 pounds. In the process, he added 2 1/8 inch on each arms, 5 7/8 inch on his chest, and 3 inches on each thigh. So Arthur Jones invented high-intensity training. This involves short single sets, with each set taken to the point of complete muscular failure at a frequency of once or at most twice per week. The intention is to maximize muscular hypertrophy and increase strength. The inventor of this first isolation, he's also the inventor of the first isolation lifting machines called Nautilus, which today you probably know as, like they do Bowflex. Conducted an experiment on Casey Viator, claiming everything I already listed, which is nuts. And you know, we don't, there's, again, you can read really far into this. There's a lot of different ideas presented here, but long story short, if steroids were involved, again, they're going to vastly increase recovery. So if you're just absolutely mechanically wrecking an area and then you have this enhanced capacity for recovery, it may be possible to make this happen. But it's been debated as to whether or not these results were real, and many people have tried to reproduce them and have not been able to reproduce them to the same effect. The accuracy of these results, like I said, is debated to this day. He brought back, so this idea was brought back into the mainstream by Tim Ferriss in his book 4 Hour Body. Literally, it's argued that, you know, you can basically get this physique or gain muscle mass through this methodology with minimal time invested. And you can read about Tim Ferriss's experiment with it in 4 Hour Body. Eventually, Nautilus machines became a status symbol for the peak of technology and training in the 70s and 80s. That's why in every gym you go to today, there's all of these isolation machines. They became just a cornerstone of, you know, this is the height of training for muscle development and growth. We need to talk about Rachel McLish. She is quite famous in the 80s. She won the inaugural United States Championship, as well as the as well as beating Aubrey Pollock to win that year's first ever IFBB Miss Olympia contest. Big freaking deal at the time. After her 1980s Olympia win, no other woman appeared on more magazine covers for the next 5 years. She was sponsored by Dynamics Health Equipment and Manufacturing Corporation. So she became one of the early spokespersons for one particular entity. And these breakthrough victories, together with her visual appeal, brought women's bodybuilding a further rush into the media attention, which had been jump-started into action by a woman by the name of Lisa Lyon. It's also important to note that during this period, the 1,000-pound squat record is broken. This is a big deal. Dave Waddington, who was born on May 10th, 1952 in Sandusky, Ohio. Waddington competed in 3 World's Strongest Man competitions, so strongman style. He finished 3rd in the first one in 1981 behind 2 of the most accomplished strength athletes, as you can see. As a powerlifter, Dave Waddington was briefly the super heavyweight IPF champion in the 1980s, but was later disqualified. The title passed on to Doyle Kennedy, or Kennedy. The next year, on June 13th, 1981, Waddington became the first person to squat over 1,000 pounds, which is wild. Dave Waddington was also 7-time Ohio champion and a 4-time YMCA national champion. So the key takeaways to the golden age here are this is the beginning of fitness lifestyle. And you can see to the right here how it was like books and magazines and advertising and all the smiling people and how wonderful it is. There was even this idea that like a Bally's was supposed to be like the place that you went after work and hung out with all your fitness friends while you drank smoothies and hung out in saunas and went for a dip in the pool. And they even like had ideas about building restaurants into them and everything. So it was like this all-in-one encompassing lifestyle. That wouldn't just be your activity, but also your socialization. And it was also the beginning of fitness branding, where you start to see, martial arts is one avenue, yoga is another avenue, aerobics is an avenue, strength training and bodybuilding is an avenue, powerlifting, Olympic lifting. You see the specialization and strategization occurring. Steroid use is now totally commonplace. And not very regulated at this time. I think by the 80s you start to see regulation occurring, but in the 60s and 70s, like, whatever. Like I said, you see that each field unto itself comes with its own way. So it's not just, you don't just weightlift. You weightlift and you have the Gold's Gym t-shirt and you wear the sweatbands and you listen to, the Walkman and you drink the protein drinks and you do it becomes an entire way of life at this time. But that way of life is determined by which field you've chosen. So if it's yoga, there's a totally different aesthetic and lifestyle that goes along with it. If you're a jogger, there's a totally different aesthetic and lifestyle that goes with it. And that includes the shoes you wear, the clothes you wear, the equipment you buy, the things you eat. So, and this is where you start to see the beginning of the fitness clans. A great deal of boundary pushing occurs and becomes synonymous with American culture and entertainment worldwide. You see this, like Rocky. Rocky's a great example of this. In the 80s and 90s, mega gyms are built with the intention of being, like I said, where people go after work. I already talked about this. Now we get into the 1990s through about 2010. This is known as the monster mass phase and the beginning of the functional era. So just looking at these two, you can see on the left, that's the mass monster age, and we're still in that in the bodybuilding world. And then you get into the functional era on the other side, where the physiques start to look more like early Bronze Age strongmen, but it's about this hyper degree of, it's hyper generalization. So on the left, hyper specialization, on the right, hyper generalization, but still based on traditional training principles, kind of. Key shifts in the industry at this time. Anabolic stacking and cycling have been taken way beyond anything you've seen before. And later in the CrossFit world, you also start to see, and you see it across a lot of performance sports, enhanced recovery methodologies, which is where the science is today too. If people aren't doing performance enhancing drugs, they are definitely trying to find a way to enhance recovery without them, because the key to performance enhancing drugs is they enhance recovery. So the introduction of keto to pop culture happens during this time period. You start to see keto, low carb, South Beach, Atkins, that sort of stuff. Increased focus on marketing to key fitness demographics for lifestyle branding. And what I mean by that is you see just an even greater degree of hyper focus into whatever your quote brand of lifestyle is. Increased access to off-label prescribed drugs to manage lifestyle and side effects. What I mean by that is you start to see TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, HGH, human growth hormone injections, Botox, steroids, all kinds of things, stimulants, on and on. A huge amount of surplus of personal income in the 1990s. So remarkably high amounts of expendable income just floating around during this time period for people to throw into their, in quotations, health and wellness. And I put that in quotations because I'm going to argue that this isn't particularly healthy or well. Steamrolling as a contract-driven methodology of sales to drive up accounts receivable, to show the value of a business to sell or loan against for expansion. So what this means is, this is when you start to see long-term contracts in the gym that you're not allowed out of. So a gym signs up, let's say 5,000 people at $100 a month, knowing that 5% of them will show up per day and half of them will never show up again. And then you go to say, I'm not using my membership, and they say, too bad, you're still going to pay. And if you don't pay, they send you to a collections agency. The reason for this is because all of the accounts receivable that they have on file is the value of their business plus the value of the equipment that they hold. So if they go to the bank and say, well, we have 5,000 people paying $100 a month, that's $500,000 a month coming into our business, we would like to open a chain of, and you can fill in the blank here, gyms, yoga studios, martial arts studios, whatever. This is our accounts receivable, and we are going to use that to loan against. It fueled this massive proliferation of franchise-like gyms, yoga studios, and martial arts schools, as well as cycling, you name it. If you saw a proliferation of those at that time, that's how they were doing it. Even into the early 2000s, like I said, this is pretty much 1990 up through 2010. CrossFit was 100% fueled by this. And that's what I mean by fitness franchising. All right, so when we talk about the mass monster age, there is one human being that is the perfect example of this, and that is Ronnie Coleman. Ronnie Coleman was a monster. Mr. Olympia 8 years in a row. Truly one of the most iconic bodybuilders in this era. He has had 13 back surgeries, and it has been said that every single vertebrae in his spine has been worked on. He walks with crutches now and needs a wheelchair to go long distances. He competed at nearly 145 kilograms. For those of you that don't speak kilograms, that is 300 pounds. I don't know how a human being can be 300 pounds of muscle at that level of leanness without drugs. And not just some drugs, an enormous number of drugs. And this also begins the enter of CrossFit. Founded in 2000, they realized they could make more money as an organization teaching instructors and selling franchises than training clients. So there's huge escalation here. quickly became ubiquitous with anything people did not recognize. So if you were doing something weird in a gym, like messing with a kettlebell, basically if you were doing anything that wasn't powerlifting or bodybuilding, people just assumed you were doing CrossFit. Branded itself towards kind of type A personalities that wanted more out of their fitness training. It's kind of an adrenaline junkie vibe. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it works and the intensity's there, and you definitely are going to get a lot of stimulus, and it made use of what was basically low-cost space and relatively low-cost equipment. I mean, when a Nautilus machine is $10,000, a barbell is $100. Those are very different things. I know this from personal experience. Setting up a CrossFit-style gym versus setting up a Planet Fitness or a Gold-style gym, the amount of money required is just massively different. CrossFit gyms are pretty cheap to set up. I mean, they're still expensive, particularly since you now need to have rogue equipment, and they kind of have a cornerstone on specialized equipment, but man, it's still light years different in cost. It's, ran mainly as group fitness, and you definitely see an increase in the group fitness model in the 1990s. Everything from kickboxing in martial arts schools to CrossFit in warehouses to aerobics classes in ballets. You just see a lot of group fitness at this time. Very high turnover rate due to injury, particularly early on. Later on, as they progressed, you saw a lot of gyms start to implement a preparation period. So when they bring new people in, they had kind of a beginner class, and then once you got through the beginner class, they'd let you out into the bigger world, and I'm sure that lowered injury for better retention, but early on, it was kind of anything goes. And again, created an entire lifestyle around this brand. There are people that get married in these gyms. What is it? Paleo became really, really famous through CrossFit as a low inflammation diet because, high intensity exercise causes high inflammation. And so on and so forth. Also, the CrossFit Games, you see a lot of overlap between them and Jiu-Jitsu and MMA at this time. And they're really pushing forward a lot of the recovery science stuff at this time. They've had a lot of difficulty since COVID. There was kind of a split due to political reasons, and they almost had their corporate funding for the games pulled, and this caused a split, and that split has continued into kind of multiple camps, different methods and different ideas around where people should train. But you're almost beginning now to see like a specializing again, where like certain CrossFit gyms are like power CrossFit gyms, and other ones are like gymnastic style CrossFit gyms, and others are conditioning oriented. And so it's interesting to see it happen all over again in its own microcosm. It's fascinating. There's also an expansion of yoga during this time period. Yoga expands massively in the 1990s and later to become more formalized in early 2000s. Yoga instructor trainings with an emphasis on style and lineage became the qualification, very similar to how martial arts certifies their people. High turnover contract model also made its way into this field as well. You kind of just see it across the fitness industry at the time. And that's because there were these consulting companies that were pushing this model behind the scenes in every aspect. Gyms, yoga, martial arts, so on and so forth. Loaning against high accounts receivable, same concept. Other styles became more widely available, like Bikram yoga. Bikram yoga is a more refined down, hot yoga. Again, they fell into some issues with leadership, but you see this proliferation during that time. They found more profit and more success training and licensing instructors and franchising during this time. Same thing with martial arts schools. They did the same thing. Industry's also changed a lot since COVID. And whenever I say this, I mean about a third of the industry's gone online. People get it through their phones now, or you see these big entities that kind of crumbled during that time period, and now there's kind of a lot of smaller studios that have their lineage with bigger schools or gyms, but they've kind of gone their own way. Now we're into the meta age. That's 2010 to current. And this is where we start talking about how the online world is affecting the current fitness industry. And this is really important to go over. Short answer, what is the meta age? Short answer, it's a term I made up. You're not going to see anyone else talking about this. I'm talking about this. It's a shift from organization focus to individual focus, driven by social media. It's also algorithm driven content, and a drive toward aesthetics as a business model, fueling a rise in eating disorders, steroid use, stimulant addiction, and dishonesty from, in quotations, influencers. Unrealistic standards coupled with unsafe techniques, with complex concepts cut down to short form content. We've moved toward an idealized short form fix versus a long-term health and wellness, both mentally and physically. We need to leverage the new way of communicating to promote the best in our industry has to offer, not the worst. And what I mean by this is you have an enormous number of young men and women utilizing and abusing performance-enhancing drugs to achieve an aesthetic in order to get influencer status on accounts for, frankly, what isn't even a lot of money. So you've got 22-year-old men abusing trenbuterol so that way they can grow massive physiques very, very quickly. And you see lots of stimulant addiction and eating disorders with men and women trying to achieve this aesthetic that makes them stand out and get the followers and the likes. There are pros to this, actually. There's more free information available than ever before. Long-form content is massively beneficial and widely available. Since COVID, more personal trainers have become multi-use, in-person, in-group, online. Educating and inspiring a new generation through the meta age is massive. I see more young women lifting weights today in the gym than I have ever seen before. And I think that's excellent for their long-term health and wellness. And also just their general confidence. And with young men, you see more men going toward mobility and just general health and wellness because they're getting better education through social media. Open communication and information sharing that allows innovation. This is also key, is that we can be utilizing these channels to innovate in our chosen field instead of compete. And this could propel the entire industry into a whole new generation. Great information on nutrition and supplementation is available. You can get really good information out there. The problem is you have to know what good information is. The cons is people doing it for the likes, mainly aesthetically driven content in short form. Again, the algorithm is creating a lot of the trends. Repackaging of information that goes, in quotations, viral. So people kind of just showing off in front of a camera, but not really explaining the reasoning behind it. And it may not be good for the vast majority of the population, where it might be excellent for high-level athletes. Fitness influencer is not a qualification for being a skilled coach. They're not the same thing. Overly geared toward appearance of fitness while not being upfront about the actual practices. So, what is fitness? Is it a look? Is it the ability to perform? It's a really important question. We see a rise in anxiety and depression and social isolation due to social media. There's a rise in the abuse of steroids and stimulants starting at very young ages. Useless supplement pitching. There's all kinds of supplements being sold out there that have they're absolute garbage. You pee them away, you're spending money you don't need to spend. There's plenty of meta-analysis out there on what is effective and what is ineffective for people when it comes to supplementing, and the stuff that particularly young fitness influencers are pushing is just absolute garbage. Grind culture and fitness influencing is the new MLM model. And what I mean by that is multi-level marketing. You basically see these people out there, you want to earn $10,000 a month as an online personal trainer. Here's how you do it. we can help you. You pay us thousands of dollars. We'll help you make thousands of dollars. And then in the end, if you don't achieve your level of success, they simply turn around and blame you for not, doing it right. And it's horrible. It makes people wash out of the industry that may be very good coaches. Online programming with no real coaching toward form. So, you buy your online program for $10 from your favorite fitness influencer, and you have no idea if you're doing it correctly or not. Short form information that has no context. So you feel like you've learned something even though you have no idea how it applies to the greater picture. Data is not the same as information. So you can sit there and go through 15-second clips for an hour, and the amount of data you will absorb is massive, but the amount of information that you're actually going to get that's usable is very low. And then gatekeeping. For even the people out there that are giving out good information, they're putting it behind a wall, meaning you have to spend X number of dollars or spend X amount of time with me to either be certified in my method or get the special information, or AKA, the useful information. And they do this because people are going to say, well, I should get paid for my time. Yeah, you should. But there's a difference between getting paid for your time and your skill and gatekeeping. They're very different things. So where are we going to go? The truth is the future can be whatever we make it. All the pros I listed can be leveraged and used to make a better future for every person on this planet. And I genuinely mean that. And we as professionals and athletes can not only promote, but also live by these practices. Let's all work together for more long-term benefits for ourselves and for our clients, and get back to what is at the heart and soul of this profession: better lives for ourselves and our clients. Fitness is relative. Health is relative. Being able-bodied is relative. It is not an ideal. It's relative, and we need to get back to that. Let's look forward, have a new conversation, put things into context, and continue looking for the best practices for the long term, not the short-term performance, at least for the average person. I understand that athletes out there need short-term performance-enhancing goals, but if athletes are peaking at 28 and 32, and that's what all of the information is being driven toward, what about the long-term health and wellness of our clients and people that aren't in that window? Maybe how we train athletes for maximal specialized performance isn't the best way to train for health and longevity. I know it's a shocking concept, but maybe it's not. So let's talk about what are better methodologies to help people in the long term. And let's also talk about what are the qualities that we're looking for in that. Those are really important concepts that we're going to cover in other videos. But I need you to understand that short-term performance, preparing for an aesthetics show, or being the fastest runner, or being the strongest strongman, doesn't necessarily lend itself to long-term health and wellness. Just ask Eddie Hall. He was asked if he was ever going to try to break the deadlifting record again, and he was like, absolutely not. He's like, that nearly killed me. It was nuts. And it was nuts. You saw the guy passed out right afterward. Those high levels of performance prove that it is possible, and they are important in that regard, but training the average person in the same way that those people train is not best for the industry or the health and wellness of our clients. In short, our goal should be the long-term health and wellness of our clients and of every practitioner, not the appearance of what we think is fitness. It's not about the appearance of it. It's about the actual act of it. So in the upcoming videos, we're going to cover more on this, and we're going to start to talk about, okay, what do we already know? What are the existing lenses? How can we utilize this information to get the best results for ourselves and our clients, and make it accessible to the greatest number of people for the highest degree of health and well-being and benefit for everyone, regardless of what their fitness level or able-bodied capacity is. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this informative. Please follow the links down in the description. You're going to see a ton of stuff that you can learn more about all the things that we talked about here. And if you have questions or there's things that you'd like to know more about, please leave it in the comments section. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the future videos.